مرحبا وأهلا بكم في برنامج داخل واشنطن. معكم مضيفكم روبرت ساتلوف. حين انتخب دونالد ترامب رئيسا وعاد بسياسة خارجية جديدة اسمها أمريكا أولا، وقد شملت انسحاب أمريكا من اتفاق إيران النووي واتفاق باريس للمناخ، وإقامة علاقات وثيقة مع زعماء وطنيين محافظين ومتشددين في الرياض والقاهرة وأنقرة وبرازيليا وورسو، وفرض عقوبات تجارية صارمة على الصين. بعد واحدة من انتخابات الأكثر مرارة في التاريخ الأمريكي، يبدو أن رئيسنا الجديد سيكون جو بايدن. كيف ستبدو ملامح سياساته الخارجية؟ هل سيركز على التهديدات التقليدية للأمن من جانب روسيا والصين وخطر الانتشار النووي وحاجة إلى تعزيز حقوق الإنسان والديمقراطية وخطر التطرف والإرهاب المستمر، أم أهمية قيادة المعركة ضد التغير المناخي؟ هل يمكن أن يفعل كل ذلك وفي الوقت نفسه يعالج قائمة طويلة من المشكلات الداخلية الملحة، بداية من الفيروس والانتهاء بالاقتصاد؟ لمناقشة السياسة الخارجية للإدارة المرجح أن تكون إدارة بايدن، يسرني أن أرحب بلجنتنا التي تضم خبيري السياسة الخارجية دينيس روس ووان زراتي. Welcome back to Dakhel, Washington. Well, we have a would-be president-elect, Joe Biden. He's standing in front of a lectern that says president-elect. He's giving press conferences in which he's introduced as president-elect. And so we will assume, at least for this conversation, that he is the president-elect. He's just announced his agency review teams, transition teams going to government departments and agencies to look at what is really going on and to prepare for the new administration. And he's soon to announce cabinet officers. Let's look at the likely repercussions of all this for American foreign policy with my guests, Juan Zarate and Dennis Ross. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining us today. So what can we say just about reading the tea leaves of foreign government and foreign leaders who congratulated or maybe didn't congratulate Joe Biden on what appears to have been his victory? Dennis?
Well, one of the things we're seeing is that all of our traditional allies, the Europeans, the Asians, have been very quick to come in and congratulate. Some of the countries from the Middle East took their time, a couple of days. In the case of the Saudis, I think it was not quite as long with the Prime Minister of Israel. But what we're seeing is that the reality of the Trump years, where our traditional allies were oftentimes bruised in their relations with President Trump, showed a sign of genuine relief that President-elect Biden is going to be the next American president. They see him as an internationalist. They see him as someone who believes in alliances. Having said that, they also understand President Trump wasn't completely an aberration, at least in terms of a kind of fatigue within the United States for playing a role that too oftentimes seemed to stretch us, too oftentimes seemed to have us carry the exclusive burden, and also in the trade areas, too oftentimes seemed to put America at somewhat of a disadvantage. In some ways, you could actually say that the legacy of Trump from that standpoint will provide President Biden leverage for what he does when he deals with these countries, especially on trade, on security issues. They will absolutely welcome an American leadership role because they see the consequences of when the United States does not play that role. They are worse off because of it. They feel less secure because of it. And I suspect that it means in the end that they understand that they're going to have to give a little bit more to the United States in order for the United States to play the kind of role internationally that they're most comfortable with the United States playing. So I think this pattern of who's sort of greeted and recognized quickly also tells us something about where things may be headed in a Biden administration in terms of issues related to burden sharing, as an example.
So, Juan, Dennis focused on our allies. How about our adversaries? How about China, Russia, Iran? How have they reacted to what seems like a Joe Biden victory?
Well, Rob, first of all, it's very interesting that both our allies and our adversaries have had to read the political battles within the United States and interpret them. And in some ways, dealing with the challenge of whether or not in recognizing President-elect Biden, there's an upset of the current president and whether or not that behooves them. So it's interesting that even the internal American political battles get reflected into the international domain. And to your point, Rob, the reality that you have America's competitors, main competitors, if not adversaries, being very slow to recognize the President-elect Biden, being cautious about what that might mean with respect to President Trump, somebody they don't want to upset, obviously. The big question, Rob, internally as well from the United States perspective is, does this period of dislocation create avenues or opportunities for our adversaries to take advantage on the international scene, to be more provocative? Are there things that they are more likely to do now because there is this political confusion within the U.S., or at least the semblance of confusion? And so that is a big question within the United States as the U.S. looks outward to how the world is responding to our election.
So let me ask both of you, how does a president-elect balance between sending signals about his likely foreign policy and identifying people that will be implementing it, but not step on the toes of an incumbent president? And how do people around the world try to interpret this and decipher this? I mean, who do they deal with? How do they make decisions over the next 2 months? This must be a very complex and challenging moment. Juan, I'll start with you.
Thanks, Rob. And I've had the experience of transitioning out of government from the Bush administration to the Obama administration, working very closely with the Obama team, the senior team on that transition. And I helped then incoming CIA Director Pompeo with his transition into government. So moving from Obama to the Trump administration. So I've seen both sides of it. And what's fascinating, I think there's increasing pressure every time there's a new president or president-elect that represents a sea change in not just the personality in the White House, but the personality of our policy. There's a real urge on the part of our allies in particular, but also any observer internationally, to understand what the new president and their senior team will do. And they want to influence it. They want to see glimpses of it. They want to engage with it. And you've seen controversy within the United States about the incoming administrations being too proactive about signaling their policies. We saw this with President Trump and the controversy around Russia sanctions, whether or not they would lift sanctions or be more inclined to lifting sanctions. That got some people into trouble. And so there's a real delicate balance here between a new team wanting to fulfill the promise of change, wanting to signal what new policies will bring, wanting to begin those dialogues with foreign counterparts, and the reality that you have a sitting president that represents existing U.S. policy that still needs to be respected and can't be trampled on. And I think every administration runs into that challenge. And I think you're going to see that in spades here, because there's such a desire to see a re-energizing of some of the old alliances and old engagement that, frankly, President-elect Biden represents.
Dennis, you have more than your fair share of transition experience going both ways, Democratic, Republican, Republican, Democrat. How does this process work?
I think Juan described it pretty well, but let me offer an additional perspective on it, because in the Bush 41 administration, for the first month, I was appointed as the head of the national security transition. And what I experienced in that time was a constant stream of visitors from foreign countries, not just ambassadors, but ministers coming in, wanting to get a sense of what a Bush administration would be, even though this was seen as a friendly takeover, not a hostile one, because you had a Republican vice president becoming a successor to the outgoing president, there was still an expectation that things were going to change and a very strong desire to get a sense of, okay, what's the direction going to be? Where will it change? In what areas? Who are the people likely to populate the most important positions? So what Juan was saying, there's an acute level of interest from the outside. Now, here you get into the question of what is sort of the right propriety. You can't have two presidents at the same time. You don't have two administrations at the same time. Most incoming administrations have leaned over backwards, whether it was in the case of Bush 41, not a surprise, but it was also true, I have to say, in the case of Clinton following Bush. They leaned over backwards to make it unmistakably clear there's one president at a time. By the way, Bill Clinton actually said that. And this related to issues like Kosovo and Somalia. And so I've seen it from both ends, where traditionally the instinct is to be extremely careful not to send mixed signals, not to in any way undercut the outgoing administration. What makes this such a difficult transition, at least in the early stages, is the existing administration doesn't want to admit that it's leaving. And on the one hand, it creates a powerful temptation for the incoming one to begin to create facts, to show, look, there's an inexorability to this. January 20th, there's going to be a new administration. The only qualifier I would put on that one with President-elect Biden is he will be, I think, very sensitive to not crossing certain lines, not looking like what he's doing is inappropriate. He is so determined to be a healer, so determined to reach out to Republicans. I think he will insist on the people around him leaning over backwards, not in any way to be sending messages about what the policy is going to be, but to be extremely cautious, at least in the early going. Maybe closer to the time of the inauguration, there'll be a little bit more flexibility in that regard. But I suspect we're going to see them take a great deal of care.
I can only imagine what it's like in foreign capitals trying to decipher a statement by Secretary of State Pompeo recently saying that there'll be a smooth transition to the second Trump administration. All right, when we come back after our break, I'm going to ask, starting with Juan, about unfinished business in the Trump administration and what we might see over the next several weeks in that regard, in just a moment. If you think today's politics is mean and nasty, think about the presidential election of 1800. There were 4 candidates, including outgoing President John Adams, but he came in third to Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr, who each were tied with 73 electoral votes. Neither had a majority, so the election would be decided by a vote of state delegations in the House of Representatives. The House took 35 votes to no avail. Neither candidate could win a majority. Eventually, an influential founding father of our country, former Secretary of the Treasury Alexander Hamilton, endorsed Jefferson, a longtime rival of his, but he despised Burr even more. That was just enough to give Jefferson a victory. As we all know from Broadway, the story ends in dramatic, bloody fashion, a duel between Burr and Hamilton that left Hamilton dead. At least one good thing about our current politics is that we don't settle fights that way anymore. My guests again today include Dennis Ross. Dennis is my colleague and counselor to the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. Dennis has 25 years of bipartisan experience at high levels of government, including White House tours in the Obama, Clinton, Bush, and Reagan administrations, and service as the president's special envoy for Middle East peace. Also joining us is Juan Zarate, one of our nation's leading national security experts. Juan is chairman and co-founder of the Financial Integrity Network and senior national security analyst for NBC News. His government experience includes service as assistant to President George W. Bush and Deputy National Security Advisor for combating terrorism. So, Juan, let me begin with you. President Trump, 2 months or so to go. What is his unfinished business in foreign policy, and what might he do that has complications for an incoming Biden administration?
Rob, I think you continue to see some urgency in the Trump administration around foreign policy. And I would say there's probably 3 areas that bear watching and do perhaps present both complications as well as opportunities for President-elect Biden. I think the first is in the realm of Iran, where the administration is very clear that they are going to continue to put in place elements of a maximum pressure campaign, especially through the use of sanctions.
Dennis, taking what Juan just said, if you're sitting in the office with President-elect Biden and you hear the news that President Trump is imposing new sanctions on Iran or is pursuing a policy that, in your view, runs counter to what you expect to do when you come to office, what do? Do you stay silent? Do you send private messages? What do you do?
I think a lot depends upon exactly what it is that is being done and how much you think that it's actually going to tie your hands. Part of what Juan is getting at is that the outgoing administration is hoping it can tie the hands of the incoming one and keep it on the same path. There's an irony. This is also what Juan was intimating. The irony is it also gives you more leverage with those that you're dealing with, whether it's the Iranians or the Chinese. You can both say on the one hand, look, there are certain steps we'd like to be able to take, but we can't take them. For us to undo some of what's been done comes at a political cost to us. We have to be able to point to what we're getting. So I would actually, if I were talking with him, I would say, keep your powder dry. The more you sort of suggest that your approach is going to be different, the more you're sending a message to the Iranians or to the Chinese that they can relax. You don't want them to relax. You want them to realize maybe you can open a door that lets them out of the box they're in, but it comes with a price. So I actually am not one of those who looks at what Trump is doing in this regard. I'm not happy about what's going on domestically. That's a different story, especially as it raises, in a sense, tries to delegitimize our elections. This is the last thing we should be doing. But I think on the issue of some of the steps they may take, especially with regard to sanctions, I view that as something that adds to the toolkit that's available for the incoming administration and for the incoming president.
So we only have about a minute left. New presidents often have early foreign policy crises, even crises that they don't anticipate or imagine. If you were writing a memo to President Biden, President-elect Biden, what would you list and what would you flag as something very urgent to look out for in the early days of his administration? Juan, I'll begin with you.
Rob, I think when we've seen transitions, we saw this from the George W. Bush transition to the Obama administration. What the Obama team faced, and Dennis saw this from the inside, were microaggressions, right, from foreign adversaries, poking and prodding to test the resolve of the United States. I would worry about a range of those kinds of microaggressions from Russia, from North Korea, maybe even from China, maybe Iran, to test where the new president, the new administration will draw lines and how they respond. The more that they can push the envelope, the better off those adversaries will think they will be. And I would watch for those microaggressions.
I agree with Juan, and I would focus on 2 in particular. One will be North Korea, where I think we're going to see Kim Jong-un pretty much make it clear that he might go back to testing as a way of putting a lot of pressure on the administration to do something to give him an incentive not to do so. And I think we're also going to see the Iranians push the envelope within Iraq. They still want to show that there was a consequence for the killing of Soleimani. And for them, the symbol of the consequence would be that the U.S. is somehow forced out of Iraq. Now, even if that doesn't force the Biden administration to leave Iraq, it may increase their incentive to have to deal with Iran sooner than they might want to. I don't believe the Biden administration is going to come in and feel the need that they have to immediately do something on Iran. I think they're going to feel that they need to make sure they have a common position with the British, the French, and the Germans first before they do anything. And I don't believe there's going to be an impulse to rush. The Iranians may want to build the pressure on the administration that they have to deal with them given the consequences of not doing so. So those are the two areas where I would be alerting the president-elect that we need to position ourselves. We need to be sending messages very quickly in advance that there shouldn't be any misreading of our resolve and how we might react.
All right. North Korea and Iran. Thank you. So, Juan, Dennis, thank you very much for joining us to preview the foreign policy in a would-be Biden administration. We hope to have you back in the weeks and months ahead to talk about the real thing. Bye-bye. Remember this? I long thought the State Department needs an American desk, and this administration will have one, and I will be sitting right behind it. Sounds like something Donald Trump would say, right? A variation of his America First motto. In fact, that line was uttered by pinstriped diplomat Warren Christopher in his confirmation to become Bill Clinton's Secretary of State 27 years ago. Patriotism, even a dose of nationalism, is not a Republican or Democratic monopoly. There's enough to go around. And so when Joe Biden, who was a member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee when Christopher spoke about serving on the American desk, takes the reign of American foreign policy, expect to hear a lot about how our decisions in faraway lands need to be designed to help America, and especially to help Americans, average Americans, in terms of their jobs, their livelihoods, and the health and safety of their families. Those are the goals shared by all presidents, all administrations. They often differ on how to achieve them. Since the end of World War II, the main thrust of American foreign policy was the idea that we and fellow democracies should set clear rules of international behavior, because in such clarity, there can be predictability. And with predictability, we can grow and thrive. The core of this is the theory, both magnanimous and self-interested at the same time, that a rising tide may raise all boats, but the bigger the boat, the bigger the rise, and America is a pretty big boat. On the other side of the ideological ledger is a different idea, usually a minority view, but one that found a champion in President Trump. The idea that peace, growth, and development would follow if states maximized their own national interests at all times. Pulling out of cooperative efforts like the Iran nuclear accord and the Paris Climate Treaty reflected this view. The pendulum looks like it's about to swing back. Unilateralism will be out, alliances will be in. That said, there are times, even in an era of alliances, when America may find itself necessary to go it alone, just as there were times in the Trump administration that we needed partners to achieve results. History is not a straight line, it's a long and winding road. So even in what looks like a new era of internationalism and collective action, don't be surprised when a Democratic president or a Democratic Secretary of State makes noises that have the echo of Warren Christopher 27 years ago, that without using the words Donald Trump used 4 years ago. If all politics is local, foreign policy is often local too. And a successful foreign policy, even one committed to raising all boats, is one that begins with ensuring that the big American ocean liner gets to rise too. بهذا نصل لنهاية هذه الحلقة من برنامج داخل واشنطن. إذا كانت لديكم أي استفسارات أو تعليقات حول هذه الحلقة، وخاصة حول التغيرات في السياسة الخارجية الأمريكية في الشرق الأوسط، أرجو أن تتواصلوا معي عبر تويتر على هاشتاج Inside Washington أو أن تراسلوني مباشرة على @RobSatloff. سأراكم الأسبوع المقبل، وإلى أن ألقاكم شكرا لكم وإلى اللقاء.